Have you ever worked yourself to the bone for someone you love, only to discover they see you as nothing more than a burden to be discarded? Welcome to Her True Stories. Today's story is about Maya Freeborn, a 70-year-old nurse who made the ultimate sacrifice on her birthday, working a grueling 24-hour shift to help her son pay his debts. But when she came home exhausted and heartbroken, she overheard a conversation that would change everything. Her son and his wife were planning to put her in a nursing home the moment she finished paying off their bills. "We need our lives back," they said, as if Maya's life didn't matter at all. What happened next will shock you because Maya didn't confront them, didn't cry, didn't beg. She simply vanished. And when her son finally found her 2 years later, he discovered that the frail old woman he thought he could control had become someone he never saw coming. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about a woman who learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is disappear and rebuild your life on your own terms. If you've ever felt invisible, taken for granted, or written off because of your age, Maya's transformation will inspire you and show you that it's never too late to reclaim your power. So settle in, because this story will remind you that underestimating a determined woman is always a mistake. At 70 years old, I should have been blowing out candles on a birthday cake, not clocking in for another grueling 24-hour shift at Sunset Manor. But there I was, tying my silver hair back into a neat bun and pinning my name tag to my scrubs. Maya Freeborn, licensed practical nurse. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was spending my birthday caring for people my own age, some even younger, who could afford professional care, while I worked my fingers to the bone to keep my own family afloat. "Happy birthday, Maya," called out Sandra, the day's shift supervisor, as I signed in. 70 years young today, right? You don't look a day over 55. I smiled and thanked her, though the compliment felt hollow. Yes, I'd been blessed with good genes, clear skin that had weathered 7 decades with grace, bright blue eyes that still sparkled with life, and that silver hair that people always said looked like spun moonlight. But what good was looking younger when I felt ancient inside? My phone buzzed with a text from my son Tyler. "Thanks for covering the extra shift, Mom. This really helps with the mortgage payment. Love you." 24 hours. That's what I'd agreed to work so my 45-year-old son could make his house payment on time. Again. I'd been doing this dance for 3 years now, ever since Tyler's construction business started struggling. First, it was just a small loan here and there. Then it became regular help with utilities, groceries, car payments. Now I was working double shifts at 70 years old, my arthritic hands aching as I lifted patients and my back screaming every time I bent over to change bedsheets. But he was my son, my only child, the little boy I'd raised alone after his father died in a workplace accident when Tyler was just 8 years old. I'd sacrificed everything for him, my own education, my dreams of traveling, my chance at love again. How could I say no now when he needed me? Mrs. Patterson in room 12 was having one of her difficult nights, convinced that her long-dead husband was coming to take her dancing. I spent an hour sitting with her, holding her papery hand and listening to stories about their courtship in the 1950s. There was something both beautiful and heartbreaking about the way love persisted even when memory failed. "You're such a good listener, dear," she said, her cloudy eyes focusing on me with sudden clarity. "Do you have someone special?" I thought about it. Did I? My son barely called unless he needed money. My daughter-in-law Cassandra had never warmed to me, treating me more like an inconvenient obligation than family. I had work colleagues, but no real friends. When had my world become so small? "I have my son," I said finally. Mrs. Patterson squeezed my hand. "That's nice, dear. But what about someone for you? Someone who sees you, really sees you?" The question haunted me through the night shift. As I helped Mr. Wilson to the bathroom at 3 a.m. and administer medications at 6 a.m., I kept wondering when I'd stopped being Maya and started being just Tyler's mother, or the woman who helps out. The morning finally came, and Sandra returned to relieve me. My feet were swollen, my lower back was on fire, and I had that bone-deep exhaustion that only comes from being on your feet for 24 straight hours. But Tyler's mortgage would be paid, and that's what mattered. Or so I told myself. I drove home to the small apartment I rented on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the beautiful house I'd sold 5 years ago to help Tyler with his business startup costs. The place was clean but sparse, furnished with pieces I'd picked up at thrift stores and yard sales. At 70, I was living like a college student. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw Tyler's truck in my assigned space. My heart lifted slightly. Maybe he'd come to thank me in person, or better yet, to spend some time with his mother on her birthday. I climbed the stairs to my second-floor apartment, my key ready, but I stopped when I heard voices through the thin door. Tyler was there, all right, but so was Cassandra. And they were discussing me. "Can't keep doing this forever," Cassandra was saying. "She's 70 years old, Tyler. How long do you expect her to work these crazy hours just to bail us out?" I know, Tyler replied. "But what choice do we have? The business is finally starting to turn around, but we need another 6 months, maybe a year, to get back on our feet. And then what? She'll be 71, working herself to death because you can't manage money properly." There was a pause, and then Tyler's voice dropped lower. I pressed my ear closer to the door. "Look, once she's done paying off our debts and we're stable again, we'll figure something out. Maybe it's time to start looking at nursing homes. Good ones, but affordable ones. She can't live independently forever, and honestly, we need our lives back. We need to think about our own future, our own retirement." My blood turned to ice water. "A nursing home?" Cassandra's voice was thoughtful, not horrified. "I suppose that makes sense. She wouldn't have to work anymore, and we wouldn't have to feel guilty about asking for help all the time." "Exactly. And let's be honest, she's not getting any younger. Better to make the transition now, while she's still relatively healthy, than wait for a crisis." I stood frozen in the hallway, my key halfway to the lock, as my son and his wife planned my disposal like I was an old piece of furniture they'd grown tired of moving around. "How do you think she'll take it?" Cassandra asked. Tyler laughed, and the sound was like a knife to my heart. "Mom's always been a people pleaser. She'll probably convince herself it's a good idea. And honestly, it'll be a relief for all of us. She can make friends her own age, play bingo, do whatever old people do. We can visit on weekends. Weekends. Like I was a distant relative they felt obligated to check on." I backed away from the door, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my keys. 24 hours. I'd just worked 24 hours on my 70th birthday so my son could pay his mortgage, and this was how he was repaying me. Not with gratitude, but with plans to warehouse me in some cut-rate facility where I could play bingo until I died. I made it back down the stairs and to my car before the tears came. 47 years of sacrifice. 47 years of putting Tyler first, of making sure he had everything he needed even when it meant I had nothing. And this was what it had earned me. I sat in my car and cried until there were no tears left. Then I wiped my face, started the engine, and drove away. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't face that door, couldn't pretend I hadn't heard what I'd heard. As I drove through the town where I'd spent most of my adult life, I realized something that should have terrified me, but instead felt oddly liberating. My son didn't really know me at all. He saw Maya the caregiver, Maya the problem solver, Maya the woman who said yes to everything. He had no idea about the investments I'd quietly made over the years, the life insurance policy I'd never mentioned, or the small inheritance I'd received from my aunt and never told him about. Tyler thought he was planning my future, but maybe it was time I started planning his. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Used up and cast aside when you're no longer convenient? Maya's story is just beginning, and trust me, what happens next will shock you. If you've ever been told you're too old to start over, let me tell you, that's a lie. Your story isn't over, and you still have chapters left to write. Our best-selling book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, is filled with simple, powerful steps to help you heal, rebuild, and fall in love with life again. Click the link in the description box and start your new beginning today. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Maya's revenge is about to unfold in ways that will leave you speechless. Sometimes the quietest people have the loudest surprises. I drove aimlessly for 2 hours, my mind replaying every word I'd heard through that door. The late afternoon sun was setting as I finally pulled into a parking spot at Riverside Park, a place I used to bring Tyler when he was small. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, back where I'd spent countless hours pushing him on swings and bandaging scraped knees, while he planned to push me out of his life entirely. My phone had been buzzing with texts from Tyler. "Mom, where are you? Your car isn't here. Getting worried. Call me back. Seriously, Mom, where did you go?" The concern in his messages might have touched me yesterday. Today, they just felt like guilt management. He was worried I'd overheard something, or worse, that I'd collapsed somewhere and created an inconvenience for him. I turned off my phone and sat on a bench overlooking the river, watching ducks paddle around in lazy circles. An elderly man was feeding them bread from a paper bag, completely absorbed in their simple pleasure. When had I last felt that kind of peace? The truth was, Tyler's betrayal shouldn't have surprised me. The signs had been there for years. The way he'd started treating my help as an entitlement rather than a gift, the way Cassandra rolled her eyes when I offered suggestions, the way they talked around me instead of to me during family dinners. I'd become their personal ATM and babysitter rolled into one, except I was the one doing the giving and getting nothing in return but the privilege of working myself to death for their benefit. A woman jogged past, probably in her 60s, looking strong and vibrant in her running gear. She smiled and waved, and I found myself wondering what her life looked like. Did she have children who saw her as a burden? Or had she managed to maintain her own identity, her own value beyond what she could provide for others? As darkness fell, I knew I had to go home eventually. But when I pulled into my parking space, Tyler's truck was mercifully gone. I felt like I was returning as a different person than the one who'd left. I climbed those stairs again, but this time I wasn't crying. This time I was thinking. My apartment looked different now, like I was seeing it through new eyes. The thrift store furniture, the generic artwork, the sparse decorations, it all looked like what it was, the living space of someone who'd given up on herself. But I hadn't given up on myself. I'd just forgotten who I was underneath all that giving. I made a cup of tea and sat at my small kitchen table with a notepad. At the top of the page, I wrote, "What do you mean? Your life is here, with us. With me." The possessiveness in his voice was telling. Not, "Your life is with people who love you, but with us," as if I were a belonging rather than a person. "Tyler, I've spent 47 years putting your needs first. I think it's time I put mine first for a while. But I need you, Mom. The business is finally turning around, but I still need your help for a few more months." There it was. Not "I miss you," or "I'm worried about you, but I need your help." Even in his desperation, Tyler couldn't see me as anything more than a resource. "Tyler, I overheard you and Cassandra talking. About the nursing home. About getting your lives back once I'm done paying your debts." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Mom, that wasn't, we were just talking hypothetically about the future." "Were you?" Because it sounded like you'd made some fairly specific plans. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was stressed about money, and I said things I didn't mean. You know I love you." "I know you think you do. But Tyler, love isn't just a feeling. It's how you treat people. And for years now, you've treated me like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. Another long silence. What can I do to fix this? He asked finally, and I heard the little boy he used to be in his voice. You can learn to solve your own problems. You can build a life that doesn't depend on your 70-year-old mother working herself to death to fund it. You can grow up, Tyler. But what about us? What about our family? We'll always be family. But the relationship we had before, where I give and you take, that's over. When you're ready to have an adult relationship with me, one based on mutual respect instead of financial dependence, call me. I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time in Tyler's adult life, I told him the truth about our relationship instead of enabling his illusions. The next few days brought a barrage of messages, Tyler's attempts to negotiate, to promise changes he had no intention of making, to guilt me into returning to my old role. I read them all, but didn't respond. Instead, I threw myself into my new life with increasing enthusiasm. I joined Sarah's book club and discovered I had strong opinions about contemporary fiction. I started taking watercolor classes at the community center and found I had a natural eye for color and composition. Most surprisingly, I began spending more time with Tom. What had started as friendly walks had evolved into longer conversations over coffee, shared dinners, and an easy companionship that I hadn't experienced in decades. You're blooming, he told me one evening as we watched the sunset from the cottage's deck. When I first met you, you looked like someone carrying the weight of the world. Now you look like someone who's learned to put it down. He was right. The constant tension I'd carried in my shoulders was gone. The worry lines around my eyes were softening. Even my posture was different, straighter, more confident. I was learning what it felt like to live for myself, and it was addictive. 1 month after my disappearance, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible when I was working double shifts to pay Tyler's bills. I officially retired from Sunset Manor. Sandra was sorry to lose me but understood. You've earned this, she said when I called to give my notice. Enjoy your retirement, Maya. You've worked hard enough for several lifetimes. That afternoon, I sat on the dock with a glass of wine, watching the light play on the water, and marveled at how much my life had changed in just 30 days. I was no longer Maya the caregiver, Maya the problem solver, Maya the woman who said yes to everything. I was simply Maya, a woman with her own interests, her own friends, her own choices. A woman who was learning, at 70, what it meant to be truly alive. Tyler thought I'd disappeared, but the truth was simpler and more profound. I'd finally appeared. After decades of defining myself through my service to others, I was discovering who Maya Freeborn really was when she wasn't busy being indispensable to everyone else. And I liked her very much. Maya's transformation is just beginning, and Tyler's about to learn what happens when you take someone for granted one too many times. Her quiet disappearance is turning into something much more powerful, a complete reinvention of her life. If you're loving Maya's journey from invisible caregiver to empowered woman, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. The next chapters will show you exactly what happens when a son realizes he's lost more than just his financial safety net. He's lost the mother he never really knew. Comment below. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Maya's story proves it's never too late to reclaim your power. The cottage's quiet solitude gave me space to think, and thinking led to remembering. As I sat by the fireplace that evening, cradling a cup of hot chocolate, the memories came flooding back, not the sanitized versions I usually allowed myself, but the raw, unvarnished truth of what I'd given up for Tyler. I was 25 when David died. A workplace accident at the construction site, a crane malfunction that took my husband and left me with an 8-year-old son and a mountain of debt. The life insurance barely covered David's funeral and the medical bills from his 3 days in intensive care. I'd been a nurse for only 2 years then, still building my career, still learning. But suddenly I was the sole provider for a grieving child who had nightmares every night and couldn't understand why Daddy wasn't coming home. The first sacrifice was college. I'd been taking night classes to get my bachelor's degree in nursing, dreaming of becoming a nurse practitioner someday. But between work and Tyler's needs, something had to give. I dropped out and focused on building my career, with just my LPN license. It's okay, I'd told myself. I'll go back when Tyler's older. But Tyler's needs just kept growing. Little league equipment, school supplies, clothes that he outgrew every 6 months. Then came the bigger expenses. Braces for his teeth, glasses for his nearsightedness, tutoring when he struggled with math. I took extra shifts, worked holidays, picked up weekend hours at the clinic. Other mothers were at their children's school plays. I was usually working to pay for Tyler's class trips. When Tyler turned 16, he wanted a car. Not just any car, a pickup truck like his friend Jake's. "All the cool kids have trucks, Mom," he'd said, and I'd melted at the hope in his eyes. I cashed in my small retirement account to buy him that truck, telling myself his happiness was worth more than my future security. College came next, and with it another devastating choice. I'd been saving for years, squirreling away every spare dollar for Tyler's education. But when he got accepted to state, the savings fell short. Without hesitation, I took out a second mortgage on our house, the house David and I had bought as newlyweds. "Don't worry about the money, Mom," Tyler had said, giving me a quick hug before leaving for orientation. "I'll make it up to you someday." Someday never came. Tyler changed majors 3 times, turning his 4-year degree into a 6-year odyssey. Each extra semester meant more tuition, more room and board, more books and fees. I worked double shifts to keep up with the payments, my body aging rapidly under the stress. When he finally graduated with a degree in business, I was so proud I cried at the ceremony. My son, the first person in our family to get a college education. All those sacrifices had been worth it, or so I thought. Tyler moved back home, temporarily, while he looked for a job. Temporarily stretched into 2 years. He had standards, he explained. He wasn't going to settle for just any job. He wanted something that matched his education and potential. Meanwhile, I was covering his car insurance, his cell phone, his credit card payments from college. The second mortgage was crushing me, but Tyler needed time to find himself. When he announced he was starting his own construction company, I was terrified and proud in equal measure. He had vision, he said. He was going to build something bigger than just a job, a legacy. The startup costs were substantial. Tyler needed equipment, a work truck, insurance, permits, and operating capital. He laid out his business plan with such confidence that I found myself believing in his dream too. I sold our house, the house where I'd raised him, where David and I had planned to grow old together, and gave Tyler most of the proceeds. "It's an investment in our future," he'd assured me. "When the company takes off, you'll never have to work again." The company struggled from the beginning. Tyler was good with his hands, but terrible with money. He underbid jobs, overpaid workers, and bought equipment he couldn't afford. Every few months, there was another crisis that required my help. I moved into my small apartment and picked up extra shifts. Tyler moved in with Cassandra, whom he'd met at a networking event. She was pretty and ambitious, and she treated Tyler like he was already the successful businessman he dreamed of becoming. Their wedding was small. Tyler claimed they wanted intimate, but I knew it was because they couldn't afford anything bigger. I paid for the reception anyway, using money from Aunt Ruth's inheritance that I'd been keeping for emergencies. "Thanks, Mom," Tyler had said, dancing with his new wife. "You're the best." I watched them together and felt a complex mix of emotions. Joy for his happiness, pride in the man he'd become, and a growing unease about my own future. At 65, I was still working full-time to support my married son's business ventures. The pattern continued for 5 more years. Every time Tyler's company faced a setback, I was there with another loan, another contribution, another solution. I told myself I was helping him build something sustainable, something that would eventually make us both secure. But sitting in Aunt Ruth's cottage, looking back with clear eyes, I could see the truth I'd been avoiding. Tyler had never learned to be self-sufficient because I'd never required it. Every time he faced consequences for his poor decisions, I'd swooped in to save him. I'd created a 45-year-old man who still expected his mother to solve his problems. The worst part wasn't the money I'd given him, though that was substantial. The worst part was realizing that my love had crippled him. By always being his safety net, I'd prevented him from learning to fly on his own. And now, instead of gratitude for my decades of sacrifice, I was rewarded with plans for my disposal. Once I'd paid off his debts, I'd be shipped off to a nursing home where I could play bingo and be visited on weekends like a distant relative. I stared into the fire, watching the logs crackle and burn, and felt something shift inside me. For 47 years, I defined myself by what I could give Tyler. Now it was time to discover what I could give myself. The grieving young widow who'd sacrificed everything for her son was gone. In her place was a 70-year-old woman with resources, intelligence, and, for the first time in decades, absolutely no one to take care of but herself. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. Tomorrow, I would start building a life that belonged to me. Tonight, I would mourn the years I'd lost and begin planning how to make the remaining ones count. Tyler thought he'd been planning my future, but I was about to show him that underestimating Maya Freeborn was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. 3 days into my stay at the cottage, Tyler's desperation had reached a fever pitch. My phone, which I now checked only once a day, was flooded with increasingly frantic messages. He'd progressed from annoyance to worry to something approaching panic. "Mom, this isn't funny anymore. Where are you? I drove by Sunset Manor. They said you took vacation time. Why didn't you tell me? Cassie thinks maybe you're having some kind of breakdown. Are you okay? I've called every hospital within 50 miles. Please just text me back so I know you're alive." The concern might have touched me if I hadn't heard him planning my exile just 4 days ago. Now it felt like what it was: fear that his financial safety net had vanished without warning. I was learning things about myself in the solitude of the cottage. For instance, I was an excellent cook when I had time to plan meals instead of grabbing whatever was quick between shifts. I'd made homemade bread yesterday, filling the cottage with a kind of warm, yeasty smell I remembered from my own childhood. I was also discovering that I enjoyed silence. Real silence, not the exhausted collapse into bed after working 16-hour days. This was peaceful, restorative silence that let me hear my own thoughts for the first time in years. On the 4th morning, I walked down to the lake's edge and sat on the small dock Aunt Ruth had built decades ago. The water was still and clear, reflecting the pine trees like a mirror. A loon called somewhere across the lake, its haunting voice echoing off the hills. It was here, watching minnows dart through the shallow water, that I made my decision. I wasn't going back to my old life. Not to the apartment where I lived like a college student, not to the job where I worked myself to exhaustion, not to the role of Tyler's personal bank account. I was 70 years old, and for the first time since David died, I was going to live for myself. That afternoon, I drove into Pine Ridge, the small town nearest the lake. It was the kind of place I'd always imagined retiring to: tree-lined streets, a main drag with local shops instead of chain stores, people who moved at a human pace instead of frantically rushing from one obligation to the next. I stopped at the local diner for lunch and struck up a conversation with Helen, the waitress who'd probably been working there since the Carter administration. She was curious about the cottage. Apparently, Aunt Ruth had been something of a local legend. "Ruth Freeborn was a character," Helen said, refilling my coffee cup. "Came up here from the city after her husband died, fixed up that cottage herself, learned to fish, grew a garden, wrote letters to the editor about everything from road maintenance to wildlife preservation. Lived exactly the way she wanted until the day she died. She sounds remarkable, I said. Oh, she was. Independent as they come. Used to say that too many people spend their lives waiting for permission to be happy. Helen studied my face. You favor her, you know. Same eyes. I thought about that as I drove back to the cottage. Waiting for permission to be happy. How long had I been doing exactly that? Waiting for Tyler to be successful enough that I could stop supporting him. Waiting for some magical future when I'd earned the right to think about my own needs. Ruth hadn't waited for permission. She'd simply taken her happiness into her own hands. That evening, I finally responded to Tyler's messages. Not with explanations or apologies, but with a simple text. I'm safe. I need more time. Please don't look for me. His response was immediate. Mom, please call me. I don't understand what's wrong. Did I do something? Whatever it is, we can fix it. I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me, the part that had spent 47 years putting Tyler first, wanted to call him, to soothe his worry, to make everything okay again. But I thought about Helen's words, about Aunt Ruth living exactly the way she wanted, and I turned off the phone instead. The next morning, I drove back to town and began making changes. Real changes, not the tentative half measures I'd been contemplating. First stop, the Pine Ridge Bank, where I opened a new checking account and arranged to have my pension and Social Security directly deposited there when they started. The bank manager, a pleasant woman named Joyce, was helpful and professional. She didn't ask why a 70-year-old woman was moving her financial life to a small mountain town, and I didn't volunteer the information. Second stop, the post office, where I rented a P.O. box and arranged to have my mail forwarded. Again, no questions, just efficient service. Third stop, the local utility company, where I arranged to have electricity, water, and internet connected to the cottage full-time instead of the minimal service Aunt Ruth had maintained. With each transaction, I felt lighter, more certain. This wasn't a temporary escape or a dramatic gesture. This was me choosing a life that belonged to me. By the time I returned to the cottage that afternoon, I'd been gone for 6 days. Tyler's messages had evolved from desperate to angry. Mom, this is cruel. Cassie is worried sick. I don't know what game you're playing, but it needs to stop.
Fine.
If you want to sulk like a child, go ahead. But don't expect me to keep begging. That last message almost made me laugh. Tyler was trying to guilt me into coming back by accusing me of childish behavior. The irony was spectacular. A 45-year-old man who still depended on his mother for financial support was calling her childish for taking a week to herself. I spent the evening making lists. Things I wanted to do with my remaining years. Places I wanted to see. Books I wanted to read. Skills I wanted to learn. The list was longer than I'd expected, full of dreams I'd deferred for so long I'd almost forgotten they existed. I wanted to travel, not the quick weekend trips I'd taken with Tyler when he was young, but real travel. I wanted to see Italy, to walk through vineyards in France, to watch the northern lights in Alaska. I wanted to learn things, photography, watercolor painting, maybe even how to play the piano. I'd always been good with my hands. Maybe I could take up woodworking or pottery. I wanted to garden. Really garden, not just the few tomato plants I'd grown in pots on my apartment balcony. I wanted to grow vegetables and herbs, maybe even keep chickens. Most of all, I wanted to wake up each morning and ask myself what Maya wanted to do today, instead of what Tyler needed for Maya today. The realization that all of these things were now possible, that I had the resources, the health, and finally the freedom to pursue them, was intoxicating. Tyler could look for me all he wanted. The woman he was looking for. The woman who said yes to everything, who sacrificed her own needs without question, who existed primarily as a solution to problems, was gone. I was still Maya Freeborn, but I was Maya Freeborn for myself now. And I was just getting started. 3 days into my stay at the cottage, Tyler's desperation had reached a fever pitch. My phone, which I now checked only once a day, was flooded with increasingly frantic messages. He'd progressed from annoyance to worry to something approaching panic. "Mom, this isn't funny anymore. Where are you?" "I drove by Sunset Manor. They said you took vacation time. Why didn't you tell me?" "Cassie thinks maybe you're having some kind of breakdown. Are you okay?" "I've called every hospital within 50 miles. Please just text me back so I know you're alive." The concern might have touched me if I hadn't heard him planning my exile just 4 days ago. Now it felt like what it was: fear that his financial safety net had vanished without warning. I was learning things about myself in the solitude of the cottage. For instance, I was an excellent cook when I had time to plan meals instead of grabbing whatever was quick between shifts. I'd made homemade bread yesterday, filling the cottage with a kind of warm, yeasty smell I remembered from my own childhood. I was also discovering that I enjoyed silence. Real silence, not the exhausted collapse into bed after working 16-hour days. This was peaceful, restorative silence that let me hear my own thoughts for the first time in years. On the fourth morning, I walked down to the lake's edge and sat on the small dock Aunt Ruth had built decades ago. The water was still and clear, reflecting the pine trees like a mirror. A loon called somewhere across the lake, its haunting voice echoing off the hills. It was here, watching minnows dart through the shallow water, that I made my decision. I wasn't going back to my old life. Not to the apartment where I lived like a college student, not to the job where I worked myself to exhaustion, not to the role of Tyler's personal bank account. I was 70 years old, and for the first time since David died, I was going to live for myself. That afternoon, I drove into Pine Ridge, the small town nearest the lake. It was the kind of place I'd always imagined retiring to: tree-lined streets, a main drag with local shops instead of chain stores, people who moved at a human pace instead of frantically rushing from one obligation to the next. I stopped at the local diner for lunch and struck up a conversation with Helen, the waitress who'd probably been working there since the Carter administration. She was curious about the cottage. Apparently, Aunt Ruth had been something of a local legend. "Ruth Freeborn was a character," Helen said, refilling my coffee cup. "Came up here from the city after her husband died, fixed up that cottage herself. Learned to fish, grew a garden, wrote letters to the editor about everything from road maintenance to wildlife preservation. Lived exactly the way she wanted until the day she died." "She sounds remarkable," I said. "Oh, she was independent as they come. Used to say that too many people spend their lives waiting for permission to be happy." Helen studied my face. "You favor her, you know. Same eyes." I thought about that as I drove back to the cottage. Waiting for permission to be happy. How long had I been doing exactly that? Waiting for Tyler to be successful enough that I could stop supporting him. Waiting for some magical future when I'd earned the right to think about my own needs. Ruth hadn't waited for permission. She'd simply taken her happiness into her own hands. That evening, I finally responded to Tyler's messages. Not with explanations or apologies, but with a simple text: "I'm safe. I need more time. Please don't look for me." His response was immediate. "Mom, please call me. I don't understand what's wrong. Did I do something? Whatever it is, we can fix it." I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me, the part that had spent 47 years putting Tyler first, wanted to call him, to soothe his worry, to make everything okay again. But I thought about Helen's words, about Aunt Ruth living exactly the way she wanted, and I turned off the phone instead. The next morning I drove back to town and began making changes. Real changes, not the tentative half measures I'd been contemplating. First stop, the Pine Ridge Bank, where I opened a new checking account and arranged to have my pension and Social Security directly deposited there when they started. The bank manager, a pleasant woman named Joyce, was helpful and professional. She didn't ask why a 70-year-old woman was moving her financial life to a small mountain town, and I didn't volunteer the information. Second stop, the post office, where I rented a P.O. box and arranged to have my mail forwarded. Again, no questions, just efficient service. Third stop, the local utility company, where I arranged to have electricity, water, and internet connected to the cottage full-time instead of the minimal service Aunt Ruth had maintained. With each transaction, I felt lighter, more certain. This wasn't a temporary escape or a dramatic gesture. This was me choosing a life that belonged to me. By the time I returned to the cottage that afternoon, I'd been gone for 6 days. Tyler's messages had evolved from desperate to angry. "Mom, this is cruel. Cassie is worried sick. I don't know what game you're playing, but it needs to stop.
Fine.
If you want to sulk like a child, go ahead. But don't expect me to keep begging." That last message almost made me laugh. Tyler was trying to guilt me into coming back by accusing me of childish behavior. The irony was spectacular. A 45-year-old man who still depended on his mother for financial support was calling her childish for taking a week to herself. I spent the evening making lists. Things I wanted to do with my remaining years. Places I wanted to see. Books I wanted to read. Skills I wanted to learn. The list was longer than I'd expected, full of dreams I'd deferred for so long I'd almost forgotten they existed. I wanted to travel, not the quick weekend trips I'd taken with Tyler when he was young, but real travel. I wanted to see Italy, to walk through vineyards in France, to watch the northern lights in Alaska. I wanted to learn things, photography, watercolor painting, maybe even how to play the piano. I'd always been good with my hands. Maybe I could take up woodworking or pottery. I wanted to garden. Really garden, not just the few tomato plants I'd grown in pots on my apartment balcony. I wanted to grow vegetables and herbs, maybe even keep chickens. Most of all, I wanted to wake up each morning and ask myself what Maya wanted to do today, instead of what Tyler needed from Maya today. The realization that all of these things were now possible, that I had the resources, the health, and finally the freedom to pursue them, was intoxicating. Tyler could look for me all he wanted. The woman he was looking for. The woman who said yes to everything, who sacrificed her own needs without question, who existed primarily as his solution to problems, was gone. I was still Maya Freeborn, but I was Maya Freeborn for myself now. And I was just getting started. 2 weeks into my stay at the cottage, Tyler's desperation had reached a fever pitch. My phone, which I now checked only once a day, was flooded with increasingly frantic messages. He'd progressed from annoyance to worry to something approaching panic. "Mom, this isn't funny anymore. Where are you? I drove by Sunset Manor. They said you took vacation time. Why didn't you tell me? Cassie thinks maybe you're having some kind of breakdown. Are you okay? I've called every hospital within 50 miles. Please just text me back so I know you're alive." The concern might have touched me if I hadn't heard him planning my exile just 4 days ago. Now it felt like what it was: fear that his financial safety net had vanished without warning. I was learning things about myself in the solitude of the cottage. For instance, I was an excellent cook when I had time to plan meals instead of grabbing whatever was quick between shifts. I'd made homemade bread yesterday, filling the cottage with a kind of warm, yeasty smell I remembered from my own childhood. I was also discovering that I enjoyed silence. Real silence, not the exhausted collapse into bed after working 16-hour days. This was peaceful, restorative silence that let me hear my own thoughts for the first time in years. On the 4th morning, I walked down to the lake's edge and sat on the small dock Aunt Ruth had built decades ago. The water was still and clear, reflecting the pine trees like a mirror. A loon called somewhere across the lake, its haunting voice echoing off the hills. It was here, watching minnows dart through the shallow water, that I made my decision. I wasn't going back to my old life. Not to the apartment where I lived like a college student, not to the job where I worked myself to exhaustion, not to the role of Tyler's personal bank account. I was 70 years old, and for the first time since David died, I was going to live for myself. 6 weeks after my departure, Tyler's world began to unravel in earnest. Through my network of acquaintances, Mrs. Rodriguez kept me updated. Bless her heart, I learned that Tyler and Cassandra were facing their first real financial crisis without their maternal safety net. The mortgage payment I would have covered with my birthday shift bounced. Tyler's business checking account was overdrawn, and 2 of his workers quit when their paychecks didn't clear. A major client canceled their contract after Tyler showed up to the job site drunk and belligerent, having spent the previous night drowning his sorrows at Murphy's Tavern. He came by again yesterday, Mrs. Rodriguez told me during one of our weekly phone calls. He looks terrible, unshaven, wrinkled clothes, like he's not sleeping. He asked if I'd heard from you, and when I said no, he started crying right there in the hallway. Part of me felt sorry for him. But it was a small part, overwhelmed by my growing anger at his entitlement. Tyler was 45 years old, and this was the first time in his adult life he'd faced real consequences for his poor decisions without me swooping in to save him. Meanwhile, my own life was flourishing in ways I'd never imagined. Tom and I had become inseparable, sharing morning walks, afternoon projects around the cottage, and long evening conversations that ranged from philosophy to gardening to our shared love of classic movies. I haven't felt this comfortable with another person in years, he told me one evening as we sat by the fireplace, reading our respective books in companionable silence. I understood what he meant. There was no pressure with Tom, no sense that I needed to be anything other than myself. He enjoyed my company without expecting me to solve his problems or finance his dreams. It was a revelation. Sarah had become another close friend, introducing me to the other women in her book club, a group of smart, independent women who'd carved out meaningful lives for themselves. Through them, I learned about hiking trails, local artisan markets, and volunteer opportunities at the animal shelter. For the first time in decades, I had a social life that had nothing to do with Tyler's needs or my work obligations. 8 weeks in, Tyler's desperation reached new heights. According to Mrs. Rodriguez, he'd been calling my old landlord, trying to find out if I'd given notice. When that failed, he'd started calling hospitals and police departments, claiming his elderly mother was missing and possibly suffering from dementia. The officer who came by was very nice, Mrs. Rodriguez reported. I told him you'd been perfectly lucid when we talked, and that you'd specifically said you needed time away. He seemed to understand that Tyler was more worried about his own situation than yours. Smart officer. Tyler's messages had taken on an increasingly frantic tone. Mom, whatever this is about, we can fix it. Please just come home. I'm sorry about the nursing home thing. I was an idiot. I'll never bring it up again. The business is falling apart without your help. Please don't let me lose everything Dad and I built. That last message was particularly galling. David had built a small construction business that provided for his family. Tyler had turned it into a money pit that had consumed my life savings and nearly destroyed my retirement. 2 months after my disappearance, Tyler made a decision that revealed the true depths of his desperation and entitlement. He hired a private investigator. I learned about this from an unexpected source, Tom. There was a man asking questions about you in town today. He told me over dinner at my cottage. Said he was a private investigator hired by your family to find you. Asked at the bank, the grocery store, even the post office. My blood ran cold. What did people tell him? Nothing useful, from what I could gather. You've been careful to use cash for most purchases, and the people who know you've been staying here are protective of your privacy. Tom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Maya, do you want to tell me what's really going on? I know it's none of my business, but I care about you and I'm worried. So I told him everything. The decades of sacrifice, the overheard conversation, the plans for my disposal once I'd served my usefulness. Tom listened without judgment, his expression growing increasingly grim. "That's not love," he said finally. "That's exploitation. You were right to leave." His validation meant more to me than I could express. For months, I'd been second-guessing myself, wondering if I was being too harsh, too selfish. Tom's perspective confirmed what I'd known in my heart. Tyler had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The private investigator's presence in Pine Ridge accelerated my timeline for the next phase of my plan. I'd been content to simply live my new life and let Tyler figure out his own problems, but his refusal to respect my boundaries changed everything. If he wanted to find me badly enough to hire professional help, then it was time for Tyler to learn that his mother wasn't the powerless old woman he thought she was. The next morning, I drove to the bank in Pine Ridge and made a very specific request. I wanted to transfer the majority of my assets into a trust, one that would provide for my own needs while I was alive, but would distribute the remainder according to my wishes after my death. "It's an irrevocable trust," Joyce explained as we reviewed the paperwork. "Once it's established, you can't change the beneficiaries or terms, even if you change your mind later." "I understand," I said, signing each page with steady hands. "That's exactly what I want." Tyler thought he was hunting for a confused old woman who needed to be brought home for her own good. What he would eventually find was someone who'd used his betrayal as motivation to secure her own future while cutting him out of it entirely. The private investigator could search all he wanted. By the time Tyler found me, it would be too late for him to charm or guilt his way back into my good graces, or my will. I was no longer the woman who'd sacrificed everything for her ungrateful son. I was a woman with a plan, resources, and the determination to see it through. Tyler's greed had cost him more than he could possibly imagine. He just didn't know it yet. The private investigator Tyler hired was persistent, but ultimately unsuccessful. Pine Ridge was the kind of town where newcomers were noticed and longtime residents protected their own. After 2 weeks of questions and searches, he left empty-handed, telling Tyler he'd exhausted all local leads. I knew this because Tyler called me again, his voice raw with desperation. "Mom, I hired someone to find you. I had to make sure you were safe." "You hired someone to violate my privacy," I corrected. "There's a difference. I don't understand why you're doing this to me."
To us.
"I'm losing everything. The house, the business, my marriage. Cassie is talking about leaving if I can't get our finances straightened out." The plea in his voice might have moved me 3 months ago. Now it just highlighted his complete inability to take responsibility for his own choices. "Tyler, your financial problems existed long before I left. I was just masking them by constantly bailing you out. But you're my mother. You're supposed to help your family. I did help you. For 47 years, I put your needs before mine. I worked myself to exhaustion to fund your dreams. I sacrificed my own retirement security to keep you afloat. And what did I get for it? Plans to warehouse me in a nursing home once I'd outlived my usefulness. That was never the plan. Tyler, I heard what I heard. And more importantly, I learned something about myself. I don't have to accept being treated that way. Not by anyone. Not even my son." After that conversation, I decided it was time to take more active steps to secure my future and send Tyler a clear message about consequences. My first stop was my lawyer's office in Pine Ridge. Margaret Walsh was a sharp woman in her 60s who specialized in estate planning and elder law. She'd been recommended by Sarah, and I liked her immediately. "I want to revise my will completely," I told her during our first meeting. "My son has shown that he can't be trusted with financial responsibility, and I want to ensure my assets go to people and causes that will use them wisely." Margaret nodded professionally. "That's certainly your right. Do you have specific beneficiaries in mind?
I did.
In the 3 months since leaving my old life, I discovered people and organizations that genuinely mattered to me. Tom, who'd shown me what companionship without exploitation looked like. Sarah and my book club friends, who'd given me community and purpose. The Pine Ridge Animal Shelter, where I'd started volunteering. The literacy program at the library, where I'd begun tutoring adults who were learning to read. I also want to establish some specific provisions, I continued. If my son contests the will or attempts to claim undue influence, I want him to receive nothing, not even the minimal bequest I'm considering. Margaret raised an eyebrow. That's what we call a no-contest clause. It's enforceable in this state, but I have to ask, are you sure you want to be that definitive? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Over the following weeks, I also made some strategic financial moves designed to protect my assets and send Tyler a message. I liquidated the savings account he knew about, the one I'd mentioned during our years of financial discussions, and donated the entire amount to charity. Specifically, I donated it to the National Association of Adult Children of Aging Parents, with a note requesting that the funds be used for educational programs about elder financial abuse. The donation was substantial enough to warrant a thank you letter, which I had sent to my old address. I knew Tyler would see it when he continued checking my mail, and I wanted him to understand that his mother wasn't just hiding. She was actively choosing to give her money to organizations that protected people like her from people like him. I also closed the joint bank account Tyler and I had maintained for emergencies, the one he'd used to access my funds without actually asking for them. The bank statements showing the closure and zero balance would speak for themselves. But my masterstroke was more subtle and infinitely more devastating. Through my volunteer work at the Literacy Center, I'd met James Harrison, a former investigative journalist who'd retired to Pine Ridge after a distinguished career. James had maintained connections throughout the media world, and he was fascinated by stories of elder abuse and financial exploitation. It's an epidemic, he told me over coffee one afternoon. Adult children who see their aging parents as ATMs rather than people. The stories I could tell you would make your hair curl. What if someone wanted to share their story publicly? I asked carefully. Hypothetically speaking, to help other people recognize the warning signs? James's eyes lit up with professional interest. Depends on the story. But if it's compelling enough, I still have contacts at the state newspaper. They're always looking for human interest pieces that shed light on important social issues. I spent the next 2 weeks crafting my story. Not as Maya Freeborn, but as an anonymous case study of financial elder abuse. I changed names and identifying details, but the emotional truth remained. A son who'd spent decades exploiting his mother's love, taking her money while planning to discard her when she was no longer useful. James was fascinated by the piece and agreed to shop it to his former colleagues. This is exactly the kind of story that needs to be told, he said. The writing is powerful, and the situation is sadly all too common. The article was published 3 weeks later in the Sunday edition of the state's largest newspaper, in the lifestyle section under the headline, "The Invisible Victims: When Love Becomes Exploitation." It told the story of Martha, a 70-year-old retired nurse whose adult son had spent decades treating her like a personal bank while planning to put her in a nursing home once her usefulness ended. The article detailed the subtle forms of manipulation, the gradual erosion of boundaries, and the devastating moment when Martha realized she'd enabled her own abuse. But the most powerful part was the ending. Martha's decision to reclaim her life, cut off financial support, and build new relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. I knew Tyler would see the article. Everyone in our old town read the Sunday paper, and someone would recognize elements of our story, even with the changed details. More importantly, the article served as my public declaration of independence. I wasn't hiding in shame or confusion. I was speaking out about a problem that affected thousands of older adults, and I was doing it from a position of strength rather than victimhood. Tyler called me the day after the article ran. "Did you write this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with rage. "This story about Martha. Is this supposed to be about us?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I said calmly. "Don't lie to me. Everyone's talking about it." Mrs. Rodriguez asked me if I'd seen the article about the son who stole from his mother. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? Tyler, if you see yourself in a story about elder abuse, maybe you should think about why that is." The conversation ended with him hanging up on me, but I'd accomplished my goal. The message was clear. I wasn't just leaving quietly. I was fighting back, and I had resources Tyler had never imagined. His desperation was about to become very public, and his attempts to portray me as a confused old woman were about to backfire spectacularly. The invisible victim had found her voice, and she wasn't finished using it. For months after my departure, Tyler's carefully constructed life began collapsing in earnest. Without my financial support, the cracks in his business and marriage widened into irreparable breaks. I learned about his downfall through multiple sources, creating a comprehensive picture of a man who'd finally run out of people to exploit. Mrs. Rodriguez reported that Tyler had lost the house. The bank came and put up notices, she told me during one of our calls. He and Cassandra had a terrible fight right there on the front lawn. She was screaming about how he'd lied to her about his mother's money, about how she never would have married him if she'd known he was basically broke. The irony was rich. Cassandra had been happy to benefit from my financial support when it was flowing freely, but she abandoned ship the moment the well ran dry. I wondered if Tyler saw the parallel to his own treatment of me. Through Sarah's connections, Pine Ridge was the kind of town where news traveled fast. I learned that Tyler had tried to take out a loan using my cottage as collateral. The bank had informed him that he had no legal claim to the property, which had been in Aunt Ruth's name and then transferred directly to me. Tyler's shock at discovering I owned valuable real estate he'd never known about was reportedly spectacular. He actually told a loan officer that his mother was suffering from dementia and had been manipulated into transferring property illegally, Sarah reported with barely concealed amusement. The officer suggested he might want to consult with a lawyer before making such serious accusations. Tyler's business failed completely by month 5. His reputation for unreliability, combined with his increasingly erratic behavior, had driven away his remaining clients. The construction equipment was repossessed, and Tyler was forced to declare bankruptcy. But the most satisfying news came from James, who'd maintained contacts throughout the region's business community. "Your son tried to get a job with Patterson Construction," he told me over dinner at the cottage. Apparently, he presented himself as an experienced contractor whose business had failed due to family circumstances. Tom Patterson did some checking and discovered the bankruptcy, the failed loans, and the reputation for poor work quality. He also heard about a man who'd been calling around claiming his elderly mother was missing and possibly incompetent. James paused to sip his wine, clearly enjoying the story. Patterson told me he got suspicious about anyone who'd publicly question his own mother's mental capacity while trying to access her assets. He decided Tyler wasn't the kind of person he wanted working for him. The pattern repeated itself with every construction company in the region. Tyler's attempts to portray me as a confused old woman had backfired spectacularly, marking him as someone who couldn't be trusted. Meanwhile, my own life had reached levels of contentment I'd never imagined possible. Tom and I had grown even closer, spending most of our time together, without the need for formal definitions of our relationship. We were simply two people who enjoyed each other's company and chose to share our daily lives. "I never thought I'd find this again," he told me one evening as we watched the sunset from my deck. "Companionship with someone who doesn't need me to be anything other than myself." I understood completely. At 70, I discovered what it meant to be valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. My volunteer work had expanded into multiple areas. In addition to the literacy program and animal shelter, I'd started helping at the community garden and had joined the town council's Committee on Senior Services. For the first time in my adult life, I was contributing to my community in ways that fed my soul rather than drained my resources. 6 months after my disappearance, Tyler made his final desperate play. He drove to Pine Ridge and began asking around town for information about me. His timing couldn't have been worse. By then, I was a well-known and well-liked member of the community. Tyler's questions about his confused elderly mother were met with protective silence and growing suspicion. Tom was the one who encountered him first, at the grocery store where Tyler was asking the manager if he'd seen an elderly woman matching my description. I was shopping for dinner ingredients when this man approached me, Tom told me that evening. Thin, unshaven, desperate-looking. He started asking if I'd seen his mother, described you perfectly. Said she was probably confused and might not remember her own name correctly. What did you tell him? Tom smiled grimly. I told him that if a 70-year-old woman wanted to disappear from her family, she probably had good reasons. I suggested he might want to think about why someone would go to such lengths to avoid him. Tyler's reaction had been predictable: anger, accusations that strangers were interfering in family business, demands to know where I was. Tom had walked away, but not before making it clear that Tyler wasn't welcome to harass the local residents. Similar scenes played out throughout Pine Ridge over the next 2 days. Tyler approached everyone from the bank manager to the postal clerk, growing increasingly agitated when no one would help him. His behavior became so disruptive that the local police asked him to leave town. That evening, my phone rang. Tyler's number appeared on the screen, and after 6 months of silence, I decided to answer. "I found you," he said without preamble, his voice thick with exhaustion and rage. That evening, my phone rang. Tyler's number appeared on the screen, and after 6 months of silence, I decided to answer. "I found you," he said without preamble, his voice thick with exhaustion and rage.
"Did you?"
"Because from what I hear, you found a town full of people who think you're a dangerous man looking to harm an elderly woman. They don't understand. They understand perfectly. They see a middle-aged man who's so desperate to access his mother's money that he's willing to lie about her mental capacity and harass strangers for information." Tyler was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was broken. "Mom, I've lost everything. The house, the business, my marriage. Cassie left last month. I'm living in a studio apartment and working construction for minimum wage. I need your help." For the first time in our conversation, I heard something approaching genuine humility in his voice. But it was 6 months too late. "Tyler, you didn't lose everything.
You threw it away."
You had a mother who loved you enough to sacrifice her own security for your dreams. You had a wife who believed in your potential. You had opportunities and resources that most people never get. And you squandered all of it because you never learned to value what you had. I can change. Can you? Because this conversation sounds exactly like every other crisis you've had. You're not sorry for how you treated me. You're sorry you're facing consequences. I took a deep breath, preparing to say words I never thought I'd speak to my son. "Tyler, I forgive you for everything you've done. But forgiveness doesn't mean I'm going to enable you anymore. You're 45 years old. It's time you learn to solve your own problems." I hung up before he could respond, and for the first time since leaving, I cried, not from sadness, but from relief. The last tie binding me to my old life had finally been severed. Tyler's downfall was complete, but more importantly, my transformation was finished. I was no longer Maya the caregiver or Maya the problem solver. I was simply Maya, a woman who'd learned to value herself enough to walk away from those who didn't. 7 months after my departure, Tyler appeared at my cottage, without warning. I was in the garden, harvesting tomatoes for the week's canning project, when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the pine trees, I caught a glimpse of a rusted sedan that had seen better days. Tom was inside making lunch, and I was grateful for his presence as Tyler rounded the corner of the cottage. The man walking toward me bore little resemblance to the confident businessman who'd planned my exile over my kitchen table. This Tyler was gaunt, his clothes wrinkled and cheap, his face bearing the marks of someone who'd been drinking too much and sleeping too little. "Hello, Tyler," I said calmly, continuing to pick tomatoes. I'd known this moment would come eventually, and I'd spent months preparing for it. "Mom." His voice cracked on the word. "You look good." I did look good, and we both knew it. 7 months of peace, adequate sleep, healthy food, and genuine companionship had transformed me. At 70, I was probably in the best shape I'd been in for a decade. "Thank you. How did you find me?" "It took months, but I finally hired a better investigator. Someone who specialized in tracking people who don't want to be found." Tyler moved closer, and I could smell the desperation on him like old sweat. "We need to talk."
About what?
"About coming home. About fixing this mess between us." I set down my basket of tomatoes and really looked at my son. The entitled man who discussed disposing of me was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost and frightened. I felt a complex mix of emotions: sadness for what he'd become, anger at what he'd put me through, and a surprising amount of pity. "Tyler, this isn't a mess. This is my life. The life I chose after you made it clear what you thought my role should be." "I was wrong." The words burst out of him with desperate intensity. "I was so wrong, Mom. About the nursing home, about everything. I never should have said those things." "You're right. You shouldn't have. But more importantly, you shouldn't have thought them." Tyler ran his hands through his thinning hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was frustrated about homework or chores. "I know I screwed up. I know I took advantage of your generosity. But I'm different now. I've learned my lesson. Have you? Or have you just run out of other options?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke. Tyler's face flushed with anger, the same anger he'd shown as a child when confronted with consequences for his actions. "That's not fair. You're my mother. You can't just abandon your family because you're mad about something I said." And there it was, the entitlement that had poisoned our relationship for decades. Even now, facing the complete collapse of his life, Tyler still couldn't see me as anything more than a resource he was entitled to access. "Tyler, I didn't abandon you. I finally stopped enabling you. There's a difference." Tom appeared on the cottage's front porch, drawn by the sound of raised voices. He didn't say anything, but his presence was a reminder that I was no longer alone, no longer without support or protection. Tyler noticed him immediately. "Who's that?" "A friend." "A friend." Tyler's voice rose with incredulous anger. "You disappear for 7 months, and now you have a boyfriend? What about Dad's memory? What about family loyalty?" I felt my own anger rising, not the hot, impulsive anger of my youth, but the cold, controlled fury of someone who'd been pushed too far. "Don't you dare talk to me about loyalty. Don't you dare invoke your father's memory to justify your selfishness. David would be ashamed of what you became." Tyler stepped backward as if I'd slapped him. "That's a terrible thing to say." "It's a true thing to say. Your father worked himself to death building something meaningful, something that would provide for his family. You turned his legacy into a money pit that nearly destroyed my retirement. You treated me like a personal bank account while planning to warehouse me in a facility once I'd served my purpose. And now you're angry because I chose to live for myself instead of dying for you. I never asked you to die for me. Didn't you? You asked me to work 24-hour shifts at 70 years old. You asked me to exhaust my savings and risk my future to cover your mistakes. You asked me to sacrifice my health, my dreams, and my dignity so you could avoid the consequences of your poor choices. What did you think the end result would be? Tyler was crying now, tears of frustration and self-pity streaming down his face. I need you, Mom. I can't do this alone. You're not alone because you need to be. You're alone because you drove away everyone who cared about you. Cassandra, your friends, your business partners, they all left when they realized you couldn't be trusted. And you want to know the saddest part? I picked up my basket of tomatoes and walked toward the cottage, pausing beside him. The saddest part is that if you'd shown me even a fraction of the respect you showed strangers, I would have helped you forever. If you'd valued me as a person instead of just as a source of money, I would have moved heaven and earth to support your dreams. But you couldn't see past your own needs long enough to realize what you were throwing away. Tyler grabbed my arm, his grip desperate and surprisingly strong. Please, Mom. I'm begging you. I have nothing left. No money, no job prospects, nowhere to live. If you don't help me, I'll end up on the street. I looked down at his hand on my arm, the same hand that had signed papers selling my house to fund his failures, the same hand that had taken money from our joint account without asking, the same hand that had waved dismissively when he talked about putting me in a nursing home. Tyler, let go of my arm. Something in my voice must have warned him, because he released me immediately. You're not going to end up on the street because I won't help you. You're going to end up on the street because you never learned to help yourself. There's a difference. I walked toward the cottage, leaving him standing alone in my garden. This isn't over, he called after me, desperation making his voice shrill. You're still my mother. You can't just abandon your responsibilities. I turned back one final time. Tyler, I fulfilled my responsibilities as a mother when I raised you to adulthood. Everything I did after that was love, not obligation. And you repaid that love with exploitation and disrespect. I'm done. Tom opened the cottage door as I approached, his expression grave but supportive. Behind me, I heard Tyler's car door slam and the engine struggle to start. By the time I reached the porch, he was gone. Are you okay? Tom asked, putting his arm around my shoulders. I thought about it. Was I okay? I'd just cut ties with my only child, probably forever. I'd watched him drive away knowing he might very well end up homeless and destitute. A year ago, the thought would have destroyed me. Now, I felt something I'd never experienced in relation to Tyler. Peace. I'm okay, I said and meant it. I'm finally okay. The confrontation I'd been dreading for months was over, and I discovered something important about myself. I was strong enough to love my son without destroying myself for him. Tyler thought he'd found a confused old woman he could guilt into resuming her old role. Instead, he'd found someone who'd learned the difference between love and enabling, between family and exploitation. The woman who'd worked 24-hour shifts to pay her son's bills was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that the greatest gift she could give Tyler was the chance to finally grow up, even if he never took it. 2 years had passed since Tyler's desperate visit to my cottage, and my life had settled into a rhythm of contentment I never thought possible. Tom and I had quietly married the previous spring in a small ceremony attended by our Pine Ridge friends, a celebration of companionship and mutual respect that felt nothing like the desperate young love of my first marriage. We'd moved into Tom's larger house by the lake, and I'd sold the cottage to a young family from the city who wanted to escape urban life. Watching them discover the same peace I'd found there felt like passing on a gift. My volunteer work had expanded into a role as coordinator for Pine Ridge's senior services, helping other older adults navigate the transition from caregiver to independent person. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd found my true calling in my 70s, after decades of thinking my only value lay in what I could sacrifice for others. Tyler had tried to contact me sporadically over the 2 years, birthday cards, occasional emails, Christmas gifts I returned unopened. Each attempt felt less like genuine remorse and more like testing whether my resolve had weakened. It hadn't. Through mutual acquaintances, I'd learned that he'd managed to avoid homelessness by moving in with a woman he'd met. Tyler doesn't know about Maya. The list was longer than I'd expected. Savings account with $47,000 from careful budgeting and my aunt's inheritance. Life insurance policy worth $200,000. Investment portfolio worth approximately $75,000, built slowly over 30 years. Paid-off cottage on Lake Morrison, inherited from Aunt Ruth, never mentioned to Tyler. Pension from the hospital would start at 72. Social Security benefits. Perfect credit score. I stared at the list, amazed. On paper, I was worth nearly $350,000, not counting my pension and Social Security. I wasn't the broke old lady Tyler thought I was. I was just the broke old lady I'd chosen to pretend to be because I loved him. My phone had dozens more messages now, increasingly frantic. Mom, I'm really worried. Please call. Cassie thinks maybe you went to see Dr. Morrison. Are you sick? I'm about to call the police. Where are you? I turned the phone off again. Let him worry. Let him imagine all the scenarios where his personal bank account suddenly vanished. Maybe it would give him a taste of what real fear felt like. The next morning, I woke up feeling more rested than I had in months, despite everything. I'd made a decision sometime during the night, though I wasn't entirely sure when. I was done being Tyler's safety net. Done being his fallback plan. Done being the person he took for granted until he needed something. I was going to disappear. Not dramatically, not with fanfare or confrontation. I was simply going to stop being available for his convenience while I figured out what Maya Freeborn actually wanted from her remaining years. I called Sunset Manor and requested 2 weeks of vacation time. Sandra was surprised. I hadn't taken a real vacation in 5 years, but she approved it without question. Then I called my bank and arranged to have my direct deposit sent to a different account, one Tyler didn't know existed. Finally, I packed a suitcase with enough clothes for a week, loaded my car with essentials, and left a simple note on my kitchen table. Tyler, I need some time to think. I'm safe and will be in touch when I'm ready.
Don't worry about me.
I locked the apartment and drove away, this time knowing exactly where I was going. Lake Morrison was an hour north of town, nestled in the foothills where the air was cleaner and the pace of life slower. Aunt Ruth's cottage sat on a small rise overlooking the water, surrounded by pine trees and accessible by a winding gravel road that most people never bothered to explore. I'd inherited the place 15 years ago, but had never spent more than a weekend there. Tyler had suggested selling it multiple times. Think of what that land is worth, Mom. But I'd always made excuses. Something about the cottage called to me, as if it was waiting for the right moment in my life. This was the moment. The cottage was small but charming, with knotty pine walls, a stone fireplace, and large windows that framed the lake like living paintings. It needed some updating. The appliances were old. The bathroom could use work, but it was solid and peaceful and mine. I spent the afternoon cleaning and airing out rooms that had been closed too long. As I worked, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about my own future. My phone was full of increasingly desperate messages from Tyler. He'd apparently gone to my apartment and found the note, because the tone shifted from annoyed to panicked. Mom, what do you mean you need time to think? Think about what? This isn't like you. Please come home. I'm sorry if I said something wrong. We can talk about it.
Mom, please.
I love you. That last message almost broke my resolve. Almost. But then I remembered his voice through the door. Once she's done paying off our debts, we'll figure something out. Maybe it's time to start looking at nursing homes.
Love.
He said he loved me, but his version of love looked a lot like use. I turned off the phone and spent my first evening in 15 years without worrying about Tyler's problems. Instead, I sat on the cottage's small deck, watched the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and pink, and began planning the next chapter of my life. The woman who'd driven up that gravel road wasn't the same woman who'd left town that morning. She was someone who remembered what it felt like to have choices. And there you have it, Maya's incredible journey from invisible caregiver to empowered woman who finally learned to put herself first. Her son thought he was planning her disposal, but instead he gave her the greatest gift imaginable, the motivation to reclaim her own life. Maya's story proves that it's never too late to walk away from people who take you for granted, even if they're your own family. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst behaviors and let them face the consequences of their choices. What did you think of Maya's transformation? Was her revenge justified, or did she go too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing your perspectives on these complex family dynamics. And if Maya's story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible or taken for granted by the people you love most, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your story matters. Your worth isn't measured by what you can give others, and it's never too late to start living for yourself. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more incredible true stories of justice, transformation, and triumph. And remember, if you're ready to start your own journey of healing and empowerment, check out our book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, in the description below. It's filled with practical steps to help you rebuild your life and discover your worth, just like Maya did. Thanks for watching Her True Stories. Remember, your story isn't over until you say it is. Keep writing those chapters, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care of yourselves, you deserve it.